We're misunderstood. We're being criticized. Things are not going the way we want them to.
For 32 years, she sat in the same pew. She knew every hymn, every face, every tradition. Then, one year, everything changed. The cross at the front of the church disappeared. The music changed. The
People who are in
language changed.
process, like
And
I
when
am,
she
like you
asked
are.
why,
When Rick and I
We've been through deaths in the family, cancer, job loss, suicide, you name it, all kinds of different problems.
a few months later, she stopped coming. Her story isn't rare. It's part of a pattern that spread through thousands of churches, all tied to one book, The Purpose-Driven Life. Written by Rick Warren, the book became a global phenomenon.
One of the most, it's a phenomenon, Rick. That's all there is to it. It's Purpose-Driven Life, 50 million copies published.
Tens of millions of copies sold, translated into dozens of languages. Churches didn't just read it, they reorganized around it. Programs were launched, structures were rebuilt, services were redesigned. At first, it looked like success. Attendance went up, energy returned, leaders felt hopeful again. But beneath that growth, something else was happening, something slower, quieter, and harder to measure. Because the same changes bringing new people in were slowly pushing others out. And by the time many churches realized it, the damage was already done. The question is, how did something meant to give people purpose leave so many churches filled with regret? In the early 2000s, churches across America were searching for answers. Attendance was flattening. Younger generations were drifting away. Then came a solution that seemed simple: a 40-day journey, a clear structure, a proven system. The 40 Days of Purpose campaign spread fast. Churches bought the materials in bulk. Small groups formed almost overnight. Sermons followed a shared outline. For many pastors, it felt like a breakthrough. They no longer had to guess what might work. The system was already built. And for a while, it worked. Attendance rose. New visitors showed up. Parking lots filled again. Some churches reported their biggest growth in years. Inside Saddleback Church, the model had already proven itself. Now others believed they could replicate it. But that assumption hid a problem, because what worked in one place doesn't always work everywhere. And what looked like growth at the surface wasn't always growth underneath. At first, no one questioned it. Why would they? The numbers looked good, the energy felt real. But growth can be misleading, because sometimes what feels like momentum is actually the beginning of something else. The changes didn't happen all at once. They came step by step. First, the music shifted. Hymns faded out. Bands replaced organs. Then the visuals changed. Screens replaced books. Stages replaced altars. Even the words began to change. Sanctuary became auditorium. Members became attendees. Sermons became messages. It wasn't just style, it was identity. The model encouraged churches to think differently, not just as places of worship, but as experiences to design. Leaders were taught to study their audience, to remove anything that might feel uncomfortable, to make church easier to enter. In some ways, it worked. More people visited, more felt welcome. But something else started to shift. The focus slowly moved from depth to accessibility. And for longtime members, the change felt deeper than it looked. Because what was being removed wasn't just tradition, it was meaning. And once that shift begins, it raises a difficult question. If you change what a church feels like, at what point does it stop feeling like a church at all? At first, most people stayed quiet. They assumed the changes were temporary. But they weren't. The old songs didn't come back. The old structure didn't return. And slowly, tension began to build. Older members felt out of place. Younger attendees adapted quickly. The divide wasn't loud at first, but it was real. Some spoke up. They asked questions, raised concerns, but those concerns were often reframed, not as feedback, but as resistance. Resistance to growth, resistance to change. And in some churches, the message became clear. If you can't move forward, you might be left behind. At the same time, leadership structures were shifting. Decisions were made faster by fewer people. The church began to feel less like a community and more like an organization. And for those who had helped build it, that shift felt personal. Because they weren't just losing preferences, they were losing their place. And once that feeling sets in, it doesn't fade easily. It spreads, quietly at first, then all at once. Behind the changes was a deeper idea. The church wasn't just adapting, it was being redesigned. The model borrowed heavily from the business world. Target audiences, brand identity, user experience. Churches began asking new questions. Who are we trying to reach? What do they want? What might turn them away? In theory, it made sense. Lower the barriers, increase access. But it also created a new dynamic. The church began to mirror the culture around it, and that culture was already changing. People expected convenience, choice, comfort. So churches adapted to meet those expectations. But that created a loop. The more churches adapted to consumers, the more consumers expected adaptation. And over time, commitment began to weaken. Because when something is designed to be easy to enter, it often becomes easy to leave. What started as a strategy for growth quietly reshaped the behavior of the people inside it. And not everyone noticed, because on the surface, everything still looked successful. But underneath, the foundation was shifting. And foundations don't fail all at once. They fail slowly, until one day they don't hold anymore. A few years later, the first real signs appeared. Not in attendance, but in retention. People were coming, but they weren't staying. Studies around that time showed a pattern. Visitor numbers were strong. Long-term commitment was not. Even Willow Creek Community Church found something unexpected. Their most committed members felt the least fed. The very people holding the church together felt like something was missing. At the same time, another issue surfaced: volunteer burnout. Programs kept expanding, events increased, but fewer people were willing to carry the load long term, and many of those who did were the same longtime members already feeling displaced. The pressure grew, not loudly, but steadily, because the system depended on energy that wasn't being replaced. And once that energy fades, the cracks begin to show. Not in one place, but everywhere at once. And by then, the question wasn't whether something was wrong, it was how long it could be held together. Then came the turning point. Not a single moment, but a pattern repeated across churches. Members began to leave. In some cases, they formed new churches. In others, they stopped attending entirely. What had once been stable communities became divided. And in certain places, the changes were reversed. Traditional elements returned. Programs were scaled back. Leaders began asking different questions. Not how to grow faster, but how to rebuild what was lost. Even at Saddleback Church, the model faced new challenges after leadership changes. The system that once seemed easy to replicate proved harder to sustain, because it had been built around a unique context, a specific leader, a specific moment in time. And when those conditions changed, the results changed too. what worked at scale didn't always translate elsewhere. And for many churches, that realization came late, after the changes, after the conflict, after the people were already gone. And once that happens, you don't just rebuild structure, you try to rebuild trust. Looking back, the story isn't simple. Some churches grew. Some people found faith. But others lost something they couldn't replace: community, identity, belonging. The model promised purpose, and for many it delivered direction. But it also raised a deeper question, one that still hasn't been fully answered. Can a church grow by adapting to people without becoming shaped by them? Can something built for depth survive when it's redesigned for accessibility? Because the tension was never just about music or structure. It was about something deeper, what a church is supposed to be, and what happens when that definition changes. Today, many of those same questions remain, not just in one movement, but across modern churches everywhere. Because the pressure to grow hasn't disappeared. If anything, it's increased. And the same strategies are still being used, still being tested, still being repeated. Which leads to a final question, one that thousands of churches are still living through right now. What if the next wave of growth is already setting up the next wave of regret?